Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, January 10th, 2022, and today I'm going to be taking a look at the RealClearPolitics battle for the United States Senate map that they have provided us with that constitutes of toss-up lean Dem, lean Republican, likely Dem, likely Republican, and safe Dem and safe Republican seats, and ratings for every single one of these races in the upcoming midterm year. Actually, this year. It's kind of hard to believe that we're now finally in the 2022 year. It seems that just yesterday we were talking about the Georgia runoff elections, and a week prior we were talking about the 2020 presidential election. But American politics actually moves quite fast. And looking at these ratings, they might have been here for quite some time now. I guess I never actually picked up on it. I remember looking for it in the past, and I never actually was able to find it, but I'm glad that I did now, and we can actually talk about it pretty in depth, because I don't know if I necessarily agree with many of these projections, and they also seem to be very interesting, and that actually is very common for RealClearPolitics to have very different ratings than what a bunch of other political pundits and networks actually end up projecting. Now, looking at this, they put the Republican Party ahead at 47 seats. The Democrats remain at 46. They have a total of 7 complete toss-up seats where they have not made a characterization in one direction or the other. And these are honestly quite predictable seats. You have Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and North Carolina. Sorry, New Hampshire. I already said North Carolina. But I don't know if I necessarily agree with North Carolina being here, but for the rest of them, I would say these are definitely going to be amongst the closest races in this election. Now, beyond this is where it gets a little bit tricky. I see that Missouri is rated as a lean Republican seat, but Iowa is considered to be safe. A very interesting rating if you ask me. The state of Ohio and Florida, I do agree, should have a similar characterization, but I don't know if lean is actually doing it justice in terms of the Republican Party's advantage across the state. Looking at the state of Colorado, a lean Democratic characterization is actually what I just shifted it over from in my most recent projection at the beginning of this year, where I actually moved it back into the likely column. And looking at the states that they consider to be likely, they have Illinois Senator Tammy Duckworth. You also have Richard Blumenthal in the state of Connecticut, and you have Patty Murray in the state of Washington. And seeing those likely Democratic seats, I'm honestly quite surprised. I mean, these are seats that are going to be very solid for the Democratic Party, and it really doesn't make sense to characterize them as likely. The only reason why I could see it maybe as likely is for a potential closer margin than what we are used to, but beyond that, these seats are solid Dem through and through. And on the Republican side, you also have 2 seats that are considered likely Republican that really don't make much sense. You have Alabama's open Senate seat here, where we don't know who the Republican nominee is going to be, but we do know that the Alabama Senate race is going to go to the GOP regardless. In the state of Alaska, you have Lisa Murkowski, who is the incumbent there, who is more than likely going to face off against another Republican in the final runoff election through the ranked choice voting situation. So I guess the final round, not necessarily the final runoff, but the state of Alaska, I think at the end of the day, it isn't really likely GOP if the top 2 contenders are 2 Republicans that are more than likely to face each other, meaning that partisan control won't change. The only person at risk there is potentially the incumbent Lisa Murkowski. Now that we've gone through this entire map and you've heard a lot of my concerns, we can get down to a bit more of a specific and, I guess, minuscule field of view looking at these races. Now, FiveThirtyEight has released ratings in previous elections. They have not released their 2022 ratings, but I would probably argue that they look very similar to mine when you look at the comparison in, at least historically speaking, 2018, 2020. Not necessarily at all trying to insinuate that there's any type of influence from my channel on FiveThirtyEight's eventual map, but just that there seems to be, at least amongst the greater election community, a very clear consensus about where a bunch of these Senate races are going to go that RealClearPolitics doesn't seem to hone in on in multiple elections. I mean, it isn't just this one. And, you know, from what we've seen from other political YouTubers, from what you've seen from the Cook Political Report, from Inside Elections, from what you've seen from Sabato's Crystal Ball, everything altogether pretty much makes sense based off of this map, the one that I have most recently projected, and a bunch of other ones. And altogether, you find clear and consistent characterizations in a bunch of these states. But RealClearPolitics actually throws us for a bit of a loop. I mean, to see Missouri in the lean Republican column is honestly quite surprising. This is a race that I've already rated as safe Republican, and the only real reason why maybe it could be considered lean Republican is if there is an exceptionally bad GOP candidate, and even then, in a red wave year that 2022 is ending up shaping up to be, which can change but doesn't look like it's going to, looking at the state of Missouri being in the lean column really is just making me uneasy, if I'm being quite honest with you. And for Missouri to have the same characterization as Ohio, where Ohio has been much more competitive in recent election history, at least for the Democratic Party, it really doesn't make sense to see them both share a similar characterization. I think that, seeing Missouri there completely goes against what my most recent projection and many other people have come together to agree upon, and to see Iowa as a safe Republican seat is quite surprising. Now, Real Clear Politics, like I said, has actually had some very interesting projections. If you look at the 2020 projections, I don't actually have it, but we'll talk about the electoral map here. Let's go ahead and open it up from the 2016 presidential election, because unfortunately, I guess I didn't focus on the 2020 map. You'll notice here that for some reason, Real Clear Politics decides to characterize states that we know they are going to go solidly for a certain party and rate them potentially as lean. And I'll show you what I mean by that. For instance, the state of South Carolina was considered lean Republican. That never really made any sense back in 2016. For Connecticut and Oregon to have been lean Republican when Oregon ended up going to Hillary Clinton by 10.6%. In addition to that, when you take a look at the margin in the state of Connecticut, Hillary Clinton ended up winning Connecticut by 12.2%. To see it as lean Democrat is quite interesting, to say the least. And on top of that, I think it was something, at least a point of interest, to see that Wisconsin and Connecticut and Oregon and Minnesota all shared the same and similar characterization. For Minnesota and Wisconsin, states decided by 2 points or less in both ways, Republican or Democratic victories, to be characterized to two states that ended up going to Hillary Clinton by double digits was quite fascinating, to say the least. Now, this map actually isn't as bad as the 2020 map, and I think that might be a testament to a bunch of different things, but what we see in the 2020 map is that you can go ahead and check it out yourself. Unfortunately, I cannot pull it up here. You will find that a bunch of states that should not have been characterized as toss-ups were characterized as toss-ups, or at least the ratings never really made much sense. And while I do agree with a lot of this map, I also disagree with a hefty amount of it as well. Alabama is out of place. Alaska, I think, is also out of place. Missouri is out of place. Ohio and Florida should shift over to the right. Colorado should shift over to the left. Illinois, Connecticut, and Washington don't really have a reason to be in this competitive position, but here we are. And I think maybe this has to do with the fact that Real Clear Politics also leans a bit towards the right. When you take a look at everything that they post and they expand upon in their right column, if you're watching about the generic ballot polling numbers or the congressional approval rating or the Joe Biden approval rating, whatever you might see, is that on the right side, there is something called Real Clear Life, and there is also a recommended tab. And seeing the recommended tab and the Real Clear Life, I tend to ignore it, and I don't really draw much attention to it towards my videos, but what you will see if you keep a close eye on it is that Real Clear Politics tends to promote an ideology that leans towards the right. It used to be a nonpartisan source of information, and I use it for polls because I think they do well with polling averages, but I do recognize some type of inherent bias. And not to say that people don't have inherent biases. I have one, you have one. Anything that is a human endeavor, you will inevitably have some type of inherent bias. But actually, I would argue that Real Clear Politics goes beyond some type of subtle / inherent bias and goes into a full-on, at least lean towards the right in terms of what I have seen. So maybe that could be a reason why some of the authors on Real Clear Politics have come together and argued that Illinois, Connecticut, and Washington are competitive. But at the end of the day, they simply are not. Looking at the 2020 presidential election, you will see exactly what you need to know. Washington voted for Joe Biden by a margin of 19 percentage points. Taking a look at the next state of Connecticut, I mean, you are seeing a state that Joe Biden won by over 20 percentage points, and the state of Illinois where Joe Biden won by 16 percentage points across the state. I mean, these are states that are not going to be competitive, and when you take a look, maybe they could be considered likely in another type of situation, but for the sake of our current election and the sake of what we are looking at now with an increasingly more polarized nation and the GOP not necessarily having a stake in these states like they used to. Actually, before I go into 2016, I'm going to show you 2010 just because I think it is something to point out. But 2010 was the last time we had a red wave year besides 2014, at least. 2016 is arguable, but Democrats gained seats in the Senate, gained seats in the House of Representatives there. But looking at the results in Connecticut, I mean, it was decided by 12 points. The Democrats won by 12 points in 2010. The state of the state of Illinois might have gone to the GOP, but then in 2016 had a resounding defeat for the GOP in this state. Tammy Duckworth winning by 15 percentage points across the state. I mean, you can see significant swings between then and now because the country was much more prone and much more able to elect people. across partisan lines in the late 2000s, actually for long times before then, but the late 2000s and the early 2010s was the last time we started to see consistent pushback against opposition party candidates, regardless of who they were, regardless of what state it was. It's become increasingly more difficult to win as a member of the opposition party because polarization has reached an all-time high, I would say, in recent American politics. Obviously, at different points in the nation, we were much more polarized because a lot more issues were discussed, and it seemed to be a straight partisan divide in other situations. But I do think that recently, I don't think this is a refutable claim, but maybe it is, that polarization is definitely attributed to the fact that based off of how a state votes on the presidential level, you tend to see them win later down the line. And then you have the state of Washington, where in 2010 might have been close. Maybe. I think, yes, it was close. And I think that that is a fair characterization to make it even lean Democrat in that situation. But when you go to 2016, what you'll find is that Illinois voted for Tammy Duckworth by 15 points. You'll find that Connecticut voted for Richard Blumenthal by a margin of nearly 30 points. What you'll find is that the state of Washington voted for Patty Murray by a margin of 18 points. Even in 2016, where Donald Trump had a monumental impact on the entire country, and keep in mind that Hillary Clinton was winning in the state of Connecticut by not 30 points, but by a margin of just 14 percentage points if you round upwards across the state. And here was the Senate election going for Richard Blumenthal by a resounding margin, nearly 30 points, a 29-point victory there. You're not going to see these states super competitive. So from what I've gathered is that this map is a bit overestimating Republican support when it comes down to Democratic seats. Colorado says it, Washington says it, Connecticut says it, Illinois says it. You could also argue, and I think this is also a fair estimation to an extent, that the likely GOP seats here are characterized, or at least the GOP seats right now, are characterized a bit more in favor of the Democratic Party. And it is quite interesting to see. One thing that I do want to say is that, and I should have mentioned this before, is that RealClearPolitics loves to cover all of their bases. So when you see a map, the final map might look like this. When you see a map now and you compare it in a year from today, you will find that the map probably didn't change much. And I think that largely has to do with the fact that keeping states in a toss-up column is a cop-out. Keeping states in a toss-up column is a way for you to not have any type of eventual reaction as a response to either side winning the seat, because you rated it as a toss-up, which means you can't be wrong. And I will say that at different points in time, I have come to the conclusion that a state might truly be a toss-up, and I cannot find a way to make a characterization, but I always end up pushing myself beyond that limit and saying, okay, if I was to put money on it, if I was to characterize the seat today and I needed to, here's how I would do it. And that's the map that I've been providing you guys with. I mean, I'm sure that many maps, there could be a situation where truly it is difficult to tell. Very difficult to tell. But I don't think it's right to leave it just up in the air. And the fact that there are 7 toss-up seats don't really surprise me, because that's truly what the final map could look like. In 2016, actually, there was a RealClearPolitics map. And you can actually see here that the state of Washington wasn't likely D. The state of Illinois was, and that was because it was a pickup. And I think that was fair because there was a Republican incumbent. The state of Connecticut wasn't likely D. And seeing the new map, it doesn't look too much different. The states that cross over, you have Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Nevada. These are 4 states that were characterized as toss-ups in 2016 that are again toss-ups in 2022. But what you will find is that some of these margins didn't end up being toss-up margins, and you very well could have characterized them in favor of the GOP if you put a bit more time and effort into thinking about the circumstance that we are in. Looking at these states, Indiana, I think it's potentially arguable that it could have been a state where the Democratic Party really wasn't going to do well. And even with Evan Bayh on the ticket there, and even though early polling data may have suggested it, by the end of it, we actually began to realize. I do remember vividly watching the exceptional climb for Evan Bayh in polling data and in support and in expectation of victory on 538, and this steady decline eventually until the Republicans flipped over there, even when I was barely following American politics at that point in time. I mean, you have some of these states that were characterized in a way like Louisiana that really should not have been characterized in such a way, that didn't end up being as pro-Dem as the map might have suggested. So this map definitely has a lot of issues and a lot of things that I do think need some improvements. I think that they do tell us a very similar story for many of these safe states. I don't really disagree with any of the safe characterizations that we are proposed with now. I might have disagreed maybe 6-7 months ago about Iowa, but beyond that, this map really looks very similar in terms of safe characterizations to the ones that I'm typically used to. Now, for the likely states, I would disagree with all of the likely states that they have characterized, Democrat, Republican, whatever it might be. For the lean ones, I would say Not really. All of them probably should be shifted over, one more in favor of their own party. Missouri, I think, should be shifted two more over back into the safe column, but then again, it does depend on the Republican nominee, and it could narrow up. Maybe they are expecting that to happen. And as for these toss-up seats, the only real problem that I have is the state of North Carolina that I do think is a likely seat, but for the rest of them, they truly are toss-ups. They definitely could go back and forth between now and the time of the end of the election, and not to say that any of the other states couldn't, but these states are most likely to do so. And as we move into the end of the 2022 year over the next couple months, as we start to, not next couple months, the next 7-8 months, and as we start to figure out who the nominees are going to be, once we reach that final stretch, I think that the Real Clear Politics map will look very similar to this one, but I don't think that all of our maps will as well. I do think that we are going to be getting a much better idea of how many of these states are going to go, and I think that a lot of these early characterizations might be underestimating partisan support for either political party, but hopefully by the time we get down to November and 2022, or even before then, October, September 2022, we get a much better idea of how these states are going to go. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.